Tonight we're going to New Brunswick, New Jersey, 1922. A small city of about 33,000 people, built around old churches and older money. A place where everyone knew everyone, where family names carried the weight of generations, and where respectability was the currency that mattered most. On a Saturday morning in September of that year, two young people walking down a country lane stumbled across something beneath a crabapple tree that would consume the entire nation for the next 4 years. A man and a woman lying side by side on their backs, his arm placed beneath her shoulder, her hand resting on his knee, his hat covering his face, his calling card propped against his shoe, and between them, scattered in the grass like confetti, dozens of torn-up love letters. The man was the rector of the most prominent Episcopal church in the city. The woman was a soprano in his choir. Both had been shot in the head, and the woman's throat had been cut so deeply that her spine was nearly visible. Her tongue had been removed. They had been posed, arranged, laid out like an accusation for the world to find. The woman who became the prime suspect was the rector's wife, an heiress worth the equivalent of $30 million today, protected by the best lawyer's money could buy, and two brothers who would do anything to protect the family name. The only eyewitness was a hog farmer who claimed she saw the whole thing from the back of a mule. Her own mother called her a liar in open court. 400 people were investigated. A grand jury declined to indict. 4 years later, a tabloid newspaper forced the case back open. A trial was held, the most sensational America had ever seen, and at the end of it, 3 defendants walked free. No one was ever convicted. The case has never been closed. In the first half of this video, we'll go through exactly what happened: the affair, the night of the murders, the destroyed crime scene, the failed investigations, and the trial that collapsed under its own weight. In the second half, we'll look at what the crime scene itself reveals about the psychology behind these killings, what the posing of the bodies, the removal of the tongue, and the scattering of the love letters can tell us about the kind of mind that did this, and what it wanted the world to see. Sit back and listen to the story of the Hall Mills murders. New Brunswick, New Jersey, in the autumn of 1922, was a city that ran on reputation. It sat on the south bank of the Raritan River, roughly 33 miles southwest of New York City, connected to Manhattan by the Pennsylvania Railroad's Northeast Corridor line. The population was just under 33,000, large enough to have its own newspapers, its own courthouse, its own social elite, but small enough that the people who mattered all knew one another by name. The city had been a crossroads since before the Revolution. George Washington had marched through it. Alexander Hamilton had passed along its main road. It had incorporated as a city in 1784, 2 weeks before New York, and it carried that fact with a certain quiet pride. By 1922, New Brunswick had become two things simultaneously. It was a college town. Rutgers College sat at its center, along with the New Jersey College for Women, bringing students and faculty and the energy of young people onto its streets every autumn. And it was a company town. Johnson & Johnson had built its headquarters there in the 1880s, and the factory complex along the river employed hundreds of workers and generated the wealth that supported much of the city's civic life. The streets were lined with elms. Horse-drawn wagons still shared the road with automobiles. The houses on the better blocks were Victorian, tall, dark-paneled, heavy with mahogany furniture and the accumulated weight of old money. And at the center of the city's social life, more than any business or university, were the churches. New Brunswick was a city of steeples. The old Dutch Reformed congregations dated back to the 18th century. Christ Church, Episcopal, had been built in 1742. The theological seminary shared its grounds with Rutgers, and on a leafy corner near the campus stood the Church of St. John the Evangelist, one of the most prominent Episcopal parishes in the state. St. John's had been founded as a mission of Christ Church in 1860 and had grown steadily in the decades since. Its congregation included some of the wealthiest and most socially connected families in the city, people whose names appeared on street signs, on university buildings, on the boards of hospitals and charitable organizations. To be the rector of St. John the Evangelist was to occupy one of the most visible positions in New Brunswick. It meant presiding over christenings and funerals for families who had lived in the city for generations. It meant being invited to every dinner, every fundraiser, every civic occasion. It meant being watched. The families who filled the pews at St. John's were bound together not just by faith, but by blood and marriage. The Stevenses, the Carpenters, the Nielsen's, these were names that had been intertwined for over a century. Frances Stevens Hall's great-grandfather had thrown tea into Boston Harbor. Her uncle's wallpaper company had leased its headquarters to the founders of Johnson & Johnson. A cousin had married into the Johnson family directly. In New Brunswick, wealth did not announce itself loudly. It expressed itself through ancestry, through property, through the quiet assumption that certain families simply mattered more than others. The city's elite did not seek attention, they sought privacy, and when something threatened to embarrass them, they had the resources to make it disappear. This was the world that existed in the late summer of 1922, a small city where everyone attended church on Sunday, where the rector's wife taught Sunday school, where the choir sang hymns that drifted up into the rafters of a stone building that had stood for 60 years. A world built on the assumption that appearances were enough, that what happened behind closed doors could stay behind closed doors as long as the right people were in charge of keeping them shut. It was a world that was about to be torn open in the most public way imaginable, and the thing that tore it open was not a crime of strangers. It was not a robbery gone wrong or a drifter passing through. It was a love affair, conducted in plain sight for years by two people who believed that God himself had blessed what they were doing. And it ended beneath a crabapple tree, on a dirt lane at the edge of town, with torn letters scattered in the grass and a woman's tongue cut from her throat. Edward Wheeler Hall was born in 1881 and raised in Brooklyn, New York. He attended the Polytechnic Preparatory School, where he served as vice president of the Literary and Debating Society and president of the Interscholastic Debating League. He went on to Hobart College in Geneva, New York, where he was rumored to have been a rather wild youth, though a studious one, graduating cum laude in 1902. He received his theological degree from the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church in Manhattan and was ordained in one of the largest classes in the history of the Episcopal Diocese of New York. Hall was not a man of extraordinary physical presence. He was average in height and build, with thinning hair and brown eyes that arched warmly beneath his brows. But he had something more useful than good looks, a gregarious charisma that filled a room the moment he entered it. People wanted to be near him, they wanted his attention, and he gave it freely, particularly to the women in his congregation. In the summer of 1909, while serving as curate at a small church in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, Hall learned of an opening at the Church of St. John the Evangelist in New Brunswick. The position would give him his own congregation, a prominent one, filled with some of the wealthiest families in central New Jersey. He took it. Within a year of his arrival, Hall had become one of the most popular figures in the city. He organized Christmas fairs with acrobats and fencing bouts. He hired entertainers. He corralled the men of the church into talent shows. He brought an energy to St. John's that it had not seen before. Among the women who staffed the church's charitable booths was a 35-year-old woman named Frances Noel Stevens. She had never married, an unusual distinction in an era when a bride's average age was 21. She spent most of her time with her mother, reading and playing cards. She was neither beautiful nor glamorous, despite her considerable wealth. One reporter would later describe her as having a long, narrow face with a firm, tight-lipped mouth and unusually prominent black eyebrows. Another dispensed with the euphemisms altogether and wrote that she had the head and features of a man. But Frances Stevens came with something that a young rector on a $1,500 salary could not easily dismiss. She was an heiress. Her family, the Stevenses and the Carpenters, had been in New Brunswick for over a century. Through her mother and her aunt, she stood to inherit a fortune connected to the Johnson & Johnson Medical Supply Company. Her wealth would eventually be estimated at $1.7 million, the equivalent of nearly $30 million in today's money. What Edward saw in Frances and what Frances saw in Edward is a question that people would ask for years afterward. It may have been a marriage of convenience, his charm and ambition paired with her wealth and social position. It may have been something more, but on the afternoon of the 20th of July, 1911, the upper crust of New Brunswick filled the pews of Christ Church to watch Frances Noel Stevens walk down the aisle in her mother's wedding gown, a princess dress of white silk and Mechlin lace, and marry the 27-year-old rector of St. John the Evangelist. They moved into the three-story Victorian at 23 Nickel Avenue, Frances's family home, where she had lived with her mother, and settled into their roles. The respected rector and his wealthy wife, the couple who hosted receptions and attended every civic occasion, the couple who never had children. Living with them was Frances's younger brother, William Carpenter Stevens, known to everyone as Willie. Willie was 50 years old and had never lived on his own. He was a large, soft-faced man with thick glasses and a heavy walrus mustache, prone to impulsive behavior and occasional outbursts, but generally sunny in disposition. He could not hold a job. He spent most of his free time at the local firehouse, playing cards with the firemen and running errands, since he could not fulfill his lifelong ambition of actually becoming one. He owned a .32 caliber revolver, though the family claimed its firing mechanism had been filed down so that he could not hurt himself with it. The household also employed servants, among them a young maid named Louise Geist, who would later play an unexpected role in the story. This was the world that Edward Hall inhabited every day. A dark-paneled Victorian house, a wealthy wife 7 years his senior, an eccentric brother-in-law who could not manage alone, and a congregation that watched his every move. And then there was Alina. She had married James Mills in 1905 when she was only 17. James was a decade older, a hard-working but unambitious man of limited means who worked as both the acting sexton at St. John's and a full-time janitor at the Lord Stirling Elementary School. They lived at 49 Carmen Street, 5 blocks from the Hall residence, in a house that was frequently described as ramshackle. They had 2 children, Charlotte, born in 1906, and Daniel, born in 1910. Alina was 34 years old in 1922. She was small, slender, and pretty, with a passionate intelligence that her life with James Mills had done nothing to satisfy. Their marriage was by all accounts loveless. Charlotte would later say that her father verbally abused her mother, and that her parents had not shared a bedroom in years. Alina sang soprano in the choir at St. John's, and it was her voice that first drew the rector's attention. When Hall wrote sermons in his study, he could hear Alina's voice drifting above the others and rising into the rafters of the church. There was something divine about the way she sang hymns, he later wrote. As she climbed the octaves, inspiration came over him, and the words poured from his pen. The affair began sometime around 1919 or 1920. No one could say exactly when, and by 1922, it was an open secret among the congregation. Parishioners whispered about the suspiciously close relationship between the minister and his comely choir singer. Hall visited the Mills apartment almost every afternoon. He and Alina exchanged notes through a hymnal. They met in the countryside, in quiet places away from prying eyes. The love letters they wrote to one another were extraordinary, not just in their passion, but in their theology. Hall and Alina did not experience their affair as a sin. They experienced it as a sacrament. "Oh, honey, I am fiery today," Alina wrote, burning, flaming love. "The Lord is always near," she wrote in another, "in whatever we do, even in physical closeness, for we know he meant for his children to taste deeply of all things." Hall signed his letters DTL, short for Dein Truer Liebhaber, German for thy true lover. He called Alina his wonder heart. She called him babykins. "I just want to crush you for 2 hours," Hall wrote. "I want to see you Friday night alone by our road, where we can let out, unrestrained, that universe of joy and happiness we call ours." They read novels together about clergymen in illicit love affairs. They shared newspaper editorials arguing that the Episcopal Church should revise its rules on divorce. They had constructed for themselves an entire intellectual and spiritual framework in which their love was not a betrayal of their faith, but an expression of it. On the day she died, Alina placed on Hall's desk a clipping from the New York World, an editorial by a Manhattan minister named Percy Stickney Grant, who argued that a marriage's sacredness did not come from a priest, but from those involved. A union was blessed by their feeling and behavior. A marriage without 2 truly committed souls did not honor the Lord, and there was no reason for it to continue. Alina Mills believed that Edward Hall was going to leave his wife. Whether Edward Hall believed the same thing is a question that no one would ever be able to answer. What is certain is that by the evening of the 14th of September, 1922, the affair had reached a point from which there was no quiet retreat. Too many people knew, the letters were too numerous, the meetings were too frequent, the congregation was whispering too loudly. Something was going to happen, and on that Thursday evening, when the telephone rang at 23 Nickel Avenue and Edward Hall put on his coat and walked into the dusk, something did. On Thursday evening, the 14th of September, 1922, the telephone rang at the Hall residence at approximately 7:30. Louise Geist, the 20-year-old maid, was working in a bedroom on the second floor. She crossed the hallway to answer the call. A woman on the other end of the line asked for the Reverend. "Is that for me?" Edward called out from the bathroom. "Yes," Louise replied, to which Edward replied that he would be out in a minute. Louise went back to work, but she could not help overhearing Hall's side of the conversation. Yes, that's too bad. Yes, couldn't we make arrangements for about 8:15? Goodbye." Before long, Edward came downstairs and put on his coat. Francis entered from the porch. Louise heard the Reverend say, "I am going to make a call, dear, and will be home soon." He passed through the kitchen and out onto the back stoop where Louise was standing. "Isn't this a lovely evening?" he said before he bade Louise good night. She watched as he walked down the street and disappeared into the dusk. She would not see him alive again. 5 blocks away at 49 Carmen Street, the Mills household was going through its own evening routine. James Mills had arrived home late from work around 6:15. He and Alina ate dinner. Afterward, he went out to the front porch to work on the window boxes while Alina left the house to make a telephone call. She returned briefly, then left again. When James asked where she was going, she challenged him, "Follow me and find out." He did not follow her. He kept working on the porch until 9:45, then went inside and read the newspaper. Alina Mills boarded a trolley that evening. The motorman John Meany would later confirm that she was the last passenger off. She stepped down and walked in the direction of De Russey's Lane, a quiet dirt road on the outskirts of the city, near an abandoned property known as the Phillips Farm. A woman named Agnes Blust and her children saw Alina walking along Easton Avenue that night, carrying a small parcel. Mrs. Blust also passed Edward Hall, walking in the same direction. No one appeared to be following either of them. What happened between approximately 8:15 and 10 o'clock that night has never been established with certainty. No reliable witness has ever described the murders themselves. The only account came from a woman whose credibility would be challenged for years, and we will come to her shortly. What is known is that Edward Hall and Alina Mills walked toward the Phillips farm that evening and never came back. Back at 23 Nickel Avenue, Frances Hall would later say that she spent the evening playing solitaire. Her brother Willie came out of his room around 8:30 to say goodnight, and she went to bed. At 2:30 in the morning, she said she dressed and went out to look for her husband. She walked to the church. It was dark. She walked past the Mills apartment, also dark. Willie accompanied her. They returned home without finding Edward, and Frances went back to bed. She did not call the police. She did not call a hospital. She did not knock on the Mills' door to ask if they had seen her husband. The next morning, Friday, Louise Geist came downstairs early to prepare breakfast. She was surprised to find Willie Stevens already at the table. He was usually the last one down. "What are you doing up so early?" she asked. "I would rather have Mrs. Hall tell you," Willie replied. When Louise passed the coat rack in the hallway, she noticed that the Reverend's hat was not in its usual spot. He had not come home. Frances came down about 20 minutes later. She picked at her food, hardly eating. An incessant jingling filled the room. Frances held a set of car keys and rustled them nervously, pacing to the window whenever she heard a car slow down outside. This anxious behavior did not suit Frances Hall. Louise would later say that she had never acted this way before. That morning, Frances telephoned the police station around 7 o'clock and asked whether there had been any accidents reported. She did not leave her name. She did not say that her husband was missing. 5 blocks away, James Mills went to work on Friday morning without reporting his wife as missing. He would later explain that Alina sometimes left for a day or two without saying where she was going, and he did not bother about it. At 8:30 that morning, Mills went to the church and encountered Frances Hall. He asked whether she thought that Hall and Alina had eloped. Frances replied, according to Mills, "God knows. I think they are dead and can't come home." It was a strange thing to say. It was Friday morning. Neither spouse had been missing for more than 12 hours, and Frances Hall's first thought, according to the man who heard her say it, was that they must be dead. All day Friday, Frances paced and waited. She rattled her keys. She rushed to the window at every passing car. She contacted James Mills several times. He told her each time that Alina had not returned. That night around 11 o'clock, Louise overheard Frances on the telephone. Her ears perked up when she heard Frances say, "No, there was nobody else. He was friendly with her. She's in the choir." Saturday morning came. Edward Hall had now been missing for 36 hours. Alina Mills had been gone just as long. At some point that morning, Frances telephoned her closest cousin, Edwin Carpenter, who lived around the block. She told him everything: Edward leaving Thursday night, his absence through Friday, her growing fear. "I knew something terrible had happened," she later told a prosecutor. "He seemed the only one I could get hold of." Edwin arrived at the house. He could see that his ordinarily steely cousin was rattled in a way he had never seen before. And then in the early afternoon, the telephone rang one final time. It was a reporter named Albert Cardinal from the New Brunswick Daily Home News. And then in the early afternoon, the telephone rang one final time. It was a reporter named Albert Cardinal from the New Brunswick Daily Home News. He asked if Mr. Hall was home. Frances said he was not. He asked when he would be home. Frances asked why he was asking these questions and whether anything had happened to her husband. The reporter said he would rather let somebody else tell her. Frances hung up and immediately called the family attorney. She told him to get to the newspaper offices and find out what was happening. By the time the attorney arrived at the Phillips farm, a crowd had already gathered. The bodies had been found hours earlier. The crabapple tree was already being stripped of its bark, and the love letters, torn up, scattered in the grass between two corpses, were already being read aloud by reporters who could scarcely believe what they were holding in their hands. On the morning of Saturday, the 16th of September, 1922, a 23-year-old man named Raymond Schneider and his 15-year-old girlfriend, Pearl Baumer, were walking along a dirt road on the outskirts of New Brunswick. The road was called De Russey's Lane, a quiet, unpaved track that ran past an abandoned property known as the Phillips Farm. The lane was well known locally as a lover's lane, a place where couples went to find privacy away from the city streets. Schneider and Pearl had been having trouble the night before, but they seemed to have patched things up. They walked along the lane in the morning light, talking softly, until Pearl noticed something near a small crabapple tree at the edge of the road. She stopped, she pointed. There were two people lying on the ground. They moved closer, a man and a woman, both on their backs, both fully clothed, both perfectly still. The man was handsomely dressed in a dark gray suit, a white shirt with a stiff collar, and a white tie. His Panama hat had been placed over his face as though to shield him from the sun. At his side lay the woman, her head resting on his outstretched right arm, her left hand placed on his right knee. She wore a blue dress with red polka dots, black silk stockings, and brown shoes. Her legs were crossed demurely, and the hem of her dress had been tugged as far below her knees as the fabric would allow. A brown woolen scarf was wound tightly around her throat. Both of them were dead. Schneider grabbed Pearl's arm and they ran to the nearest house, the home of a man named Edward Stryker, where the police were telephoned immediately. Two officers arrived within minutes. Patrolman Edward Garrigan and Officer James Curran reached the crabapple tree and confirmed what the young couple had seen. The man and the woman were beyond help. They had been dead for some time. Maggots were already working their way across the man's face, beneath his hat, and into the wound at the woman's throat. The officers began to take stock of what they were looking at. The bodies had been arranged. There was no question about it. The man's right arm was extended beneath the woman's shoulder and neck. Her left hand had been placed on his knee. His hat had been positioned to cover his face, and when the officers lifted it, they found that his eyes were closed and his glasses had been repositioned, spotted with something that might have been blood or fly droppings. A county physician would later determine that unless Hall had been asleep at the moment he was shot, someone had closed his eyes and adjusted his glasses after death. The feet of both bodies pointed toward the crabapple tree. Propped against the sole of the man's left shoe was a small card, his business card. It read, "Reverend Edward W. Hall, Church of St. John the Evangelist, New Brunswick, New Jersey." And scattered in the grass between the two bodies, torn into pieces and strewn like confetti, were dozens of love letters written in pencil. The identification was immediate. The card told the officers who the man was, and within hours, a reporter named Frank Daner from the Daily Home News arrived at the scene and identified the woman. He knew the rumors about the rector and the choir singer. He leaned down, drew the scarf away from her throat, and looked past the maggots. It was Eleanor Mills. Now the officers understood what the scarf had been concealing. Eleanor's throat had been cut from ear to ear. The wound was so deep and so violent that her windpipe, esophagus, jugular vein, and the muscles of her neck had been completely severed. Her backbone was visible through the wound. Edward Hall had been shot once. The bullet had entered his head above the right ear and exited through the back of his neck on the left side, as if someone standing above him had fired downward. There was a small bruise on the tip of his left ear, and abrasions on the back of his right index finger and left little finger, marks that suggested he may have been struggling when the shot was fired. Eleanor had been shot 3 times, once under the right eye, once over the right temple, and once over the right ear. All 3 shots had been fired at close range with a .32 caliber pistol. Near the bodies, officers found a spent .32 caliber cartridge and a 2-foot piece of iron pipe. Edward's gold watch was missing. His wallet was found lying open on the ground, but there were only 61 cents in coins in his pockets. Eleanor's body was bereft of personal papers or markings of any kind, as though someone had gone through her things and removed anything that might identify her, except for the letters that had been deliberately left behind. It would not be until 4 years later, when Eleanor's body was exhumed for a second autopsy in preparation for the trial, that the full extent of what had been done to her became known. Her tongue had been cut out, her larynx had been removed. The organ of her voice, the instrument that had sung hymns in the church rafters, that had drawn the rector to her in the first place, that had spoken words of love into his ear for years, had been carved from her body and taken. It was never recovered. The killer or killers had not merely silenced Eleanor Mills. They had reached into her throat and removed the very thing that had made her dangerous. But on that Saturday morning in September, as the first officers stood over the bodies and tried to comprehend what they were seeing, that detail was still hidden. What was visible was disturbing enough. 2 people shot and cut and arranged beneath a tree, love letters torn up and scattered around them like a declaration. A calling card propped against a dead man's shoe, as if to say, look at this man. Look at what he was doing. Look at what it cost him. This was not a crime scene left behind by someone in a panic. This was a crime scene constructed by someone with something to say. And within hours, the whole world would be listening. By early afternoon on Saturday, the 16th of September, the Phillips farm had come to resemble something between a country fair and a circus. Word of the discovery had spread through New Brunswick with extraordinary speed. Reporters arrived first from the Daily Home News, then from the New York papers, then from Philadelphia. Behind them came the public, in numbers that no one had anticipated and no one could control. They came on foot, they came in automobiles. Within days, they were arriving at the rate of 1,000 cars a day, parking along the adjacent roads and trudging through the fields to the Crabapple tree. One onlooker later remarked that you could not believe it possible, in a place as isolated as that people could come in such numbers in 10 minutes. The patrolmen at the scene either could not hold the crowds back or did not bother trying. Spectators roamed freely around the bodies. They stepped over the blood-stained earth. They picked up the reverend's hat and the woman's scarf. They handled the love letters, passing them from hand to hand, reading them aloud to one another. Pieces of bark were stripped from the crabapple tree, morbid souvenirs. Within weeks, the tree would be completely bare, stripped of every branch and scrap of bark by ghoulish collectors. One enterprising individual began selling small bags of dirt from the ground, surrounding the tree for 25 cents apiece. Vendors appeared, hawking popcorn, peanuts, soft drinks, and balloons to the crowds as though the crime scene were a carnival attraction. On weekends, the Phillips farm became a destination, a place people drove to from across the state to stand where the rector and the choir singer had been found. And in the middle of all of this, the police were trying to conduct an investigation. The first critical error had already been made. When Officer Garrigan arrived that morning, a reporter named Albert Cardinal from the Daily Home News had asked if he could pick up the calling card propped against Hall's shoe. Garrigan granted permission. The card, which would later become the single most contested piece of physical evidence in the entire case, was handed to a civilian, passed among the crowd, and contaminated beyond any hope of forensic integrity before it was ever placed into official custody. No photographs were taken of the bodies in their original position. No perimeter was established around the scene. No systematic search of the surrounding area was conducted before the crowds destroyed whatever evidence might have been there. The county physician arrived and made a brief examination, but by the time the undertaker came to collect the bodies, more than 3.5 hours after their discovery, the scene had already been hopelessly compromised. And then there was the jurisdictional problem. De Russey's Lane sat just over the county line in Franklin Township, Somerset County, but the victims lived in New Brunswick, which was in Middlesex County. This meant that two separate prosecutors, Joseph Stricker in Middlesex and Azariah Beekman in Somerset, both had a claim to the case. Rather than cooperating, the two men investigated separately, each jealous of the other's authority, each reluctant to share information or defer to the other's judgment. For 2 full weeks, the rival prosecutors worked in parallel without coordinating their efforts, interviewing different witnesses, pursuing different leads, and arriving at different theories about what had happened. When they were finally compelled to work together and present suspects to a grand jury, the damage had already been done. Weeks of potential investigative momentum had been squandered in a petty bureaucratic contest. The physical evidence, meanwhile, was disappearing. The love letters had been handled by dozens of people before being collected. The calling card had been passed around the crowd. The iron pipe found near the bodies was catalogued but never conclusively connected to the crime. The spent cartridge was recovered, but without a murder weapon to match it to, it led nowhere. Hall's gold watch was missing and was never found. His wallet had contained money, perhaps as much as $50, that was also gone by the time police examined it. Whether these items were taken by the killer or by one of the hundreds of spectators who trampled through the scene on Saturday morning was never determined. Detective George Totten, one of the first county officials to survey the scene, had noted several potentially significant details: the positioning of the bodies, the condition of Hall's glasses, the arrangement of the clothing. But without photographs, without a secured perimeter, and without a systematic record of what had been found where, these observations existed only in the memories of the men who made them. One detective told reporters confidently that the case was a cinch and would be solved in a matter of days. He was wrong. The case would not be solved in days. It would not be solved in weeks or months or years. It would not be solved at all. And the reason it would not be solved began here, on this Saturday afternoon in September, when the most important crime scene in New Jersey's history was treated as a public spectacle rather than a place where evidence needed to be preserved. By the time anyone with real investigative authority took control of the scene, there was almost nothing left to investigate. The ground had been trampled by thousands of feet. The tree had been stripped bare. The evidence had been handled, pocketed, sold, or simply lost in the chaos of a crowd that had turned a double murder into an attraction. Everything that followed the failed grand jury, the cold years of silence, the tabloid frenzy, the trial that collapsed, can be traced back in part to what happened in those first few hours. The crime scene was not merely mishandled, it was destroyed. And it was destroyed in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses while the police stood by and watched it happen. Frances Stevens Hall received the news of her husband's death on Saturday afternoon, the 16th of September, from her cousin Elovin Carpenter. Elovin had gone to the Phillips farm with the family attorney and her husband Edwin. They had seen the bodies with their own eyes. Edwin had leaned down and taken Edward's cold hand in his own, and then Elovin had returned to 23 Nickel Avenue to deliver the news. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, where Frances was waiting. "What you feared has happened," Elovin said. "He is dead." Frances broke down completely. It was the only time anyone would ever describe her losing her composure. She cried, she embraced her cousin, and then, within minutes, she pulled herself together, went downstairs to the parlor, and began receiving visitors who had come to pay their respects. From that moment forward, Frances Stevens Hall became a figure of almost preternatural calm. The newspapers would eventually call her the Iron Widow, a woman who sat through accusations, investigations, and a month-long murder trial without ever appearing to lose control of herself again. But calm is not the same thing as innocent, and in the weeks that followed, Frances's behavior raised questions that she would never satisfactorily answer. There was the anonymous telephone call she had made to the police on Friday morning, asking about accidents, but refusing to leave her name or say that her husband was missing. She would later explain that she wished to avoid unpleasant notoriety, but to investigators, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a woman who already knew that something terrible had happened and did not want her name connected to the inquiry. There was the brown coat. In the weeks after the murder, Frances sent a coat to be dyed black. The prosecution would later argue that the coat had been dyed to conceal bloodstains. A witness named Anna Behrman would testify that she had seen the coat before it was dyed and that there had not been a spot on it. Frances herself would say that she had not even worn that coat on the night in question, that she had worn a gray one instead. But the fact remained that a garment had been altered, and the timing was difficult to explain. There was the remark to James Mills on Friday morning, "I think they are dead and can't come home." It was an extraordinary thing to say about a husband who had been missing for less than 12 hours. Frances would later say that it had simply seemed obvious to her, given that Edward had never stayed out all night before. But to the prosecutors who eventually brought charges, it sounded like the words of a woman who already knew what had happened on De Russey's Lane. And then there was what Frances did in the days immediately following the discovery. She hired Timothy N. Pfeiffer, a private investigator and attorney, not to find her husband's killer, but to investigate the case on her own terms. Pfeiffer's role was never entirely clear to the public. He appeared at crime scenes. He spoke to witnesses. He inserted himself into the investigation in ways that struck many observers as an attempt to control the narrative rather than to uncover the truth. Frances had the resources to do this. She had the money to hire the best attorneys in New Jersey. She had the social connections to ensure that no one in her circle would speak to the police without counsel present. She had the family names Stevens, Carpenter, Nielsen that carried weight in every courtroom and every political office in the county. And she had her brothers. Henry Hugel Stevens was the eldest, born in 1869. He was 52 years old at the time of the murders, a retired exhibition marksman who lived 50 miles away in Lavalette on the Jersey shore with his wife Ethel. He was a sportsman, a crack shot, and a man of considerable physical confidence. He was not close with his sister in the way that Willie was, but blood was blood, and the Stevens family protected its own. When the murders became public, Henry claimed that he had been fishing in Lavalette on the night of the 14th of September, miles from New Brunswick. 3 witnesses would eventually corroborate his alibi, but other witnesses would place him in the area, and the prosecution would later argue that it would have taken an expert marksman to place 3 bullets so closely together in Eleanor Mills's skull. Henry's name carried one additional weight. Jane Gibson, the woman who would become the case's most controversial witness, claimed that on the night of the murder she had heard a woman's voice cry out one word, "Henry." Willie Stevens was a different kind of suspect entirely. He lived in the house. He was present on the night Edward Hall disappeared. He was awake in the early hours of the morning, and his behavior in the days after the murder was, at best, peculiar. On Friday morning, the morning after the murder, before the bodies had been found, Willie had been up early, waiting at the breakfast table before anyone else in the household. When Louise Geist asked what he was doing up at that hour, he told her he would rather have Mrs. Hall explain. Later that same morning, Willie told the maid something else. "Something terrible happened last night," he said. "Mrs. Hall and I have been up most of the night." He would not elaborate. On the evening after the bodies were discovered, Willie visited a man named George Kuhn, who owned a cigar store. He asked Kuhn to deny any rumors that the Hall-Stevens-Carpenter family had anything to do with the murders. This was days before anyone had publicly accused the family of involvement, and before the pig woman had named any of them. Willie also sent a suit to the dry cleaner the day after the murder. The delivery boy noticed suspicious spots on the fabric and turned the clothing over to the police. No one ever determined what the spots were because the suit was subsequently lost. And then there was the matter of the calling card. At the trial 4 years later, Fingerprint experts would testify that Willie Stevens' left index fingerprint was found on the calling card that had been propped against Edward Hall's shoe. It was the single most damning piece of physical evidence in the case, the one thing that placed a member of the Stevens family physically at the crime scene. But the card had spent 36 hours exposed to the elements. It had been picked up by a reporter, passed from hand to hand through a crowd of spectators, and handled by an unknown number of people before it ever reached the police. By the time of the trial, the defense would argue persuasively that the print could have been placed on the card at any time, that the chain of custody was hopelessly broken, and that no jury could convict on such compromised evidence. The fourth suspect was Henry de la Briere Carpenter, a Wall Street stockbroker, a cousin of Francis, who lived just 2 doors from the Hall residence on Nickel Avenue. His brother Edwin had been the one to identify Edward's body. Henry Carpenter was named by Gibson as present at the scene on the night of the murder, though she initially identified him under confused circumstances and later seemed to conflate him with Henry Stevens. Carpenter would eventually win the right to be tried separately from the other 3 defendants. His trial never took place. The charges were quietly dropped. Together, this was the group that the prosecution believed had committed the murders: a wealthy widow, 2 brothers, and a cousin. A family that had the motive, the means, and the temperament to punish a man who had humiliated them and to destroy the woman who had lured him away. But believing it and proving it were 2 very different things. The Stevens-Carpenter family had money, lawyers, and silence on their side. And the evidence that might have convicted them had been trampled into the dirt of the Phillips farm on the first day anyone thought to look for it. Jane Gibson lived with her son William in a converted barn just off DeRussey's Lane, not far from the Phillips farm. She raised hogs, Poland China hogs, and it was this detail that gave her the name the newspapers would never let go of. From the moment she entered the case, she was the pig woman, and nothing she said or did would ever be evaluated on its merits alone. It would always be filtered through that name, and through everything it implied about her class, her credibility, and her place in the world. Gibson was somewhere around 50 years old. She was combative, eccentric, and prone to feuds with her neighbors. She claimed that her deceased husband had been a minister, a claim that reporters quickly disproved. The man, William Easton, was not dead. He was alive and working as a toolmaker. When confronted, Gibson denied that Easton was her husband at all. None of this inspired confidence, but Jane Gibson said she had seen something on the night of the 14th of September, and what she described, if true, was the only eyewitness account of the murders that would ever be offered. Her story in its earliest form went like this. Around 9 o'clock on Thursday night, her dogs began barking loudly. She went outside and saw the figure of a man standing in her cornfield. Suspecting thieves, people had been stealing her corn, she mounted her mule, Jenny, and rode toward Easton Avenue to get a better look. As she drew closer, she saw that there were 4 figures standing near the crabapple tree. She heard a sharp report, a gunshot, and one of the figures fell to the ground. A woman screamed 3 times to not do it. Gibson turned her mule in the opposite direction and began riding back toward her house. Then she heard a volley of additional shots. She looked back and saw a second figure slump to the ground. And she heard a woman's voice shout one word, and that was Henry. Gibson said she had tried to tell this story to the police shortly after the murders, when a young man named Clifford Hayes was falsely arrested, but that the officers had been too busy to pay her any attention. In the weeks that followed her initial statement, Gibson added details. She described seeing an open touring car parked on Easton Avenue, similar to the car owned by the Hall family. She said that a second car had come into the lane behind her, its headlights briefly illuminating the people near the tree. In that flash of light, she said she saw a woman in a long gray coat and a man with a dark mustache and bushy hair, walking together toward the abandoned farm. She said she heard a woman's voice ask, "How do you explain these notes?" She said she saw Eleanor Mills break free and run, and then watched as the others caught her, dragged her back, and shot her 3 times. And then Gibson added one more detail, perhaps the most dramatic of all. She said she had lost a moccasin during her ride, and that around 1 o'clock in the morning she had gone back to look for it. As she approached the crabapple tree, she heard a woman crying. She drew near and saw a woman kneeling beside the Reverend's body, sobbing, a big woman with white hair. The description matched Francis Hall. The problem was that Gibson's story did not remain stable. It shifted and expanded with each telling. Details appeared that had not been present in earlier versions. The number of people at the scene changed. The sequence of events rearranged itself. Gibson herself acknowledged this openly to reporters at one point, saying that she had told one story to the press, another to the authorities, and would offer a third one on the witness stand. Her neighbors came forward in numbers to challenge her credibility. They described her as a serial liar, a woman known throughout the area for fabricating stories. A civilian reportedly bribed her $100 for corroboration of a particular detail. And her own mother, an elderly woman who would later sit in the front row of the courtroom, told anyone who would listen that her daughter was not to be believed. A woman named Mrs. Fraley, who lived directly across DeRussey's Lane from the Phillips farm, contradicted Gibson's account entirely. She said she had heard none of the sounds Gibson described, no shots, no screams, no voices in the night. Neither had any of her boarders, and Mrs. Fraley said that she had seen Gibson shortly after the murders and that the hog farmer had said nothing about witnessing anything. Despite all of this, the special prosecutor William Mott called Gibson's testimony his most valuable evidence. She was, for all her contradictions, the only person who claimed to have been present when the murders occurred. And the core of her story, that members of the Hall Stevens family were at the Crabapple tree on the night of the 14th of September, was consistent with what many people already believed. In November of 1922, a grand jury was convened. Over 5 days, 67 witnesses were called to testify. The jury heard Gibson's account. They heard about the calling card, the love letters, the movements of the suspects on the night in question. They heard from neighbors, from servants, from members of the congregation. And at the end of it, they declined to indict. No charges were filed, no arrests were made. The grand jury simply folded its hands and said there was not enough evidence to proceed. Francis Hall, free and uncharged, promptly sailed for Europe. The investigation, such as it was, ground to a halt. The police files gathered dust. The physical evidence, what little had been preserved, sat in storage without anyone to examine it. The newspapers expressed outrage. The public demanded answers. But the machinery of justice in Somerset and Middlesex counties had spoken, and what it said was that the case was over. It was not over, but it would take 4 years, a tabloid newspaper desperate for circulation, and a maid's failed marriage to bring it back to life. For 4 years, the Hall Mills case existed in a kind of limbo, officially closed, unofficially unresolved, and never quite forgotten. Frances Hall returned from Europe and resumed her life at 23 Nickel Avenue. She attended church. She managed her affairs. She lived quietly with Willie, as she always had. If the whispers of her neighbors bothered her, she gave no indication of it. James Mills went back to his janitor's work at Lord Stirling Elementary and his sexton's duties at St. John's. He continued to sweep the same floors, tend the same churchyard, and walk past the same pews where his wife had once sat and sung. Charlotte Mills, now a young woman in her 20s, embraced the flapper ethos of the era and never stopped believing that her mother's killers were walking free. The Phillips farm continued to attract visitors for months after the murders. Strangers drove out to DeRussey's Lane on weekends to stand where the bodies had lain. The crabapple tree, stripped bare of bark and branches, stood like a skeleton at the edge of the road. People still stopped and stared at the gates of Francis Hall's home on Nickel Avenue, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Iron Widow. And the tabloid newspapers refused to let the story die. The early 1920s had seen the birth of a new kind of American journalism. The New York Daily News, founded in 1919, was the country's first successful tabloid, a paper built on photographs, scandal, and the appetites of a reading public that wanted sensation rather than substance. The New York Daily Mirror, launched by William Randolph Hearst in 1924, followed the same model. These papers thrived on stories that combined wealth, sex, and violence, and the Hall Mills case offered all three in abundance. Throughout the early and middle part of the decade, the tabloids kept the case alive through sheer repetition. The Daily News staged a fake seance at the crime scene, complete with a fraudulent medium. The Daily Mirror sent reporters to New Brunswick to dig for witnesses, even unreliable ones. The New York Graphic ran illustrations and speculative reconstructions of the murders. Newspapers across the country published periodic, "Where Are They Now?" articles about the suspects and the victims' families. The coverage was relentless, irresponsible, and effective. It ensured that the case remained in the public consciousness long after the official investigation had collapsed. And then, in the summer of 1926, something happened that gave the tabloids exactly what they needed, a reason to demand that the case be reopened. A man named Arthur S. Real filed a petition for annulment of his marriage. His wife was Louise Geist, the same Louise Geist who had worked as a maid in the Hall household in 1922. The same Louise Geist who had answered the telephone on the night of the 14th of September and watched the Reverend walk into the dusk. Real's petition made an extraordinary claim. He said that his wife had withheld knowledge about the Hall Mills murders, knowledge that she had possessed since the night they occurred. According to Real, Louise had told Francis Hall on the 14th of September that the Reverend was planning to elope with Armour Mills. That same night, Louise had accompanied Francis and Willie Stevens in a car, driven to DeRussey's Lane to intercept the couple. And afterward, Louise had been paid $5,000 to keep quiet about what she had seen. Louise denied everything. She called her husband's claims a pack of lies, but it did not matter. The story was public now, and the tabloids seized it with both hands. The New York Daily Mirror ran the story across its front page on the 16th of July, 1926. Over the following days, the paper escalated with one breathless charge after another. The strategy worked, the Mirror's circulation jumped, public outrage mounted, and the pressure became too great for the state to ignore. Governor A. Harry Moore ordered a second investigation. The case was assigned to a new special prosecutor, State Senator Alexander Simpson, a sharp and experienced lawyer from Hudson County, 5 feet tall and known for his tenacity. Simpson was horrified by what he inherited. 4 years had passed since the murders, and the evidence that should have been preserved had largely vanished. Key documents were missing from the prosecutor's files. Willie Stevens' .32 caliber revolver, which had been confiscated in 1922, had been returned to him and had already been proven to have been disabled long before the night of the murders. Witnesses had moved, died, or changed their stories. The crime scene had been destroyed years ago. Even more troubling were the signs that the original investigation had been deliberately sabotaged. The Somerset County prosecutor in 1922, Azariah Beekman, had systematically mislaid vital evidence during his time on the case. His brother was later caught trying to sell grand jury testimony to a tabloid newspaper. And a state trooper named Henry Dickman, who had been independently investigating the case in 1923, had mysteriously disappeared, only to be located years later in a military prison, where he claimed he had been paid $2,500 to drop his investigation and leave the state. Despite all of this, Simpson pressed forward. He interviewed Jane Gibson again and found her story, for all its problems, still pointed in the same direction it always had. He gathered what new evidence he could. He obtained statements from witnesses who had been too afraid to speak in 1922. And on the 28th of January, 1926, arrest warrants were issued. Frances Noel Stevens Hall was arrested for the murder of Armour Mills. Her brothers, Willie Stevens and Henry Stevens, were arrested alongside her. Their cousin, Henry de la Briere Carpenter, was arrested separately and would eventually win the right to be tried on his own. All 4 defendants proclaimed their innocence loudly and eagerly to the press. Francis hired Robert McCarter, a former Attorney General of New Jersey and one of the most formidable trial lawyers in the state. The defense team assembled around the Stevens family was a wall of legal talent that the prosecution, operating on a state budget, could not hope to match. A hearing was held, 50 witnesses were called over 4 days. Bail was denied for Willie and Henry Stevens, and all 3 primary defendants were committed to stand before a grand jury. This time, unlike 1922, the grand jury returned indictments. Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Stevens were charged with the murders of Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Armour Reinhardt Mills. The trial was set for November, and by the time it began, the entire country would be watching. On the morning of Wednesday, the 3rd of November, 1926, the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville, New Jersey, opened its doors to what would become the most sensational criminal trial in American history up to that point. The courthouse was not built for spectacle. It was a modest county building in a modest town, 20 miles from New Brunswick. But on that first morning, every seat was taken. Hundreds of reporters filled the press gallery, representatives from newspapers across the country and around the world. Western Union had hired additional telegraphers to handle the volume of words that would be transmitted from this room over the coming weeks. By the time the trial concluded, reporters would file more than 12 million words. The New York Times, which normally regarded itself as above such matters, kept 4 full-time stenographers on the scene and dedicated more front-page articles to the Hall Mills case than to any previous trial in its history. When the publisher Adolf Ochs was asked about the seeming contradiction, he replied that when the Times covered such stories, they became authentic sociological documents. Among the celebrity spectators who attended the proceedings were the evangelist Billy Sunday, the novelist and playwright Mary Roberts Reinhardt, and the legendary journalist Damon Runyon. The trial had become not merely a legal proceeding but a cultural event, a place to see and be seen, a stage on which the anxieties of an entire era were being performed. The 3 defendants sat together at the defense table. Frances Hall, dressed in black, maintained the icy composure that had earned her nickname. Willie Stevens, with his thick glasses and walrus mustache, looked bewildered but alert. Henry Stevens, lean and weathered from years on the Jersey shore, sat with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had nothing to answer for. Justice Charles Parker presided, alongside Somerset County Judge Frank Cleary. The jury, all male, all married, was selected in just over an hour. The 3 defendants were being tried for the murder of Alina Reinhardt Mills. The charge carried the death penalty. The prosecution's case rested on several pillars. First, motive. Frances Hall had discovered her husband's affair and had arranged, with the help of her brothers, to confront the couple and punish them for the humiliation they had caused. The love letters, the open secret of the affair, the editorial about divorce that Alina had placed on Hall's desk the day she died, all of it pointed to a woman whose patience had finally been exhausted. Second, the fingerprint. Willie Stevens' left index fingerprint had been identified on the calling card found at Hall's feet. 3 fingerprint experts testified for the prosecution, each affirming that the print belonged to Willie. It was the only piece of physical evidence that placed any member of the Stevens family at the crime scene. Third, the witnesses. Ralph Gorsline, an assistant manager for one of the companies owned by the defendant's family, and himself rumored to have once had an affair with Alina Mills, testified that he had been on DeRussey's Lane on the night of the murder. He had been there with a woman from the choir conducting his own romantic liaison. He said he heard a shot around 10:20, followed by a woman's scream, and then 3 more shots. The scream died to a moan and then stopped altogether. He also claimed that Willie Stevens had subsequently threatened him and that Henry Stevens had attempted to bribe him. Other witnesses testified that they had seen Henry Stevens in New Brunswick on the night of the murder and on the following day, contradicting his claim that he was fishing in Lavalette, 50 miles away. Still others claimed that Frances Hall had tried to bribe them into silence. And then there was the pig woman. Jane Gibson's entrance into the courtroom was the single most theatrical moment of the trial. She was dying. Cancer had ravaged her body over the preceding months, and she could no longer walk or stand without assistance. The prosecution told the jury that she was eager to tell the truth before she departed this world. She was carried into the courtroom on a hospital bed, attended by a doctor and 2 nurses, and placed facing the jury box. Her frail voice was barely audible in the crowded room. And in the front row of the spectator gallery, placed there deliberately by the defense, sat Gibson's elderly mother. From the moment her daughter began to speak, the old woman began muttering, "She's a liar, she's a liar, she's a liar." Gibson told her story. She described the night, the figures by the crabapple tree, the shots, the screams. She said she had seen Frances Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Stevens on DeRussey's Lane that night. When the prosecution asked her to identify the defendants, she rose from her bed with what observers described as theatrical sharpness and pointed her finger directly at them. The Daily Mirror called it the most dramatic scene ever witnessed in a courtroom. But Gibson's testimony contained problems that even drama could not disguise. Her account had changed since 1922. Details had been added that were not present in her earlier statements. Some of her new recollections seemed to have been drawn directly from newspaper accounts rather than from memory. She claimed to have seen things that contradicted the autopsy findings, and when pressed on the inconsistencies, she could not explain them. At the end of her testimony, she said, "I have told the truth, so help me God, and you know it." The defense called her mother to the stand. The old woman repeated what she had been saying from the gallery. Her daughter was a liar. She had always been a liar. Neighbors and acquaintances followed, one after another, testifying that Gibson was known throughout the community as unreliable, dishonest, and prone to fabrication. The prosecution's other witnesses fared little better under cross-examination. McCarter, the defense attorney, was methodical and devastating. He picked apart alibis, exposed contradictions, and suggested alternative explanations for every piece of circumstantial evidence the state had offered. The fingerprint evidence, potentially the strongest element of the prosecution's case, was challenged on the grounds that the calling card had been exposed to the elements for 36 hours, handled by an unknown number of civilians, and stored without proper chain of custody for 4 years. The defense's own fingerprint experts testified that no reliable conclusion could be drawn from such compromised evidence. Even if the print was Willie's, they argued, it could have been placed on the card at any time. Hall was, after all, Willie's brother-in-law, and calling cards were routinely exchanged in social settings. And then the defense did something unexpected. They put their clients on the stand. Willie Stevens went first. The prosecution expected to make quick work of him, a man widely regarded as mentally deficient, eccentric, and easily confused. Senator Simpson approached the witness box with confidence. He left it humiliated. Willie was sharp, logical, and unshakable. He answered every question directly and without hesitation. He kept to his story with a consistency that Simpson could not crack. When the prosecutor attempted to confuse him with rapid-fire questioning, Willie simply waited, then answered calmly and precisely. The courtroom audience, spectators, reporters, even some of the jurors, found themselves charmed by the odd, bespectacled man with the walrus mustache who refused to be rattled. James Thurber would later write an essay about Willie Stevens' performance on the stand, marveling at the man's unexpected poise and intelligence. It was, by most accounts, the moment the prosecution's case began to collapse. Frances Hall took the stand next. Simpson pressed her about the statements she had made to James Mills, the remark that she believed they were dead. He challenged her about the anonymous telephone call to the police, about her failure to report her husband missing, about the nocturnal trip to the church. Frances answered every question with the same measured calm she had maintained since the first day of the trial. She admitted nothing. She conceded nothing. She gave the prosecutor nothing to work with. Henry Stevens testified that he had been fishing on the night of the murder, and 3 witnesses corroborated his account. After 23 days of testimony, 157 witnesses had been called, 87 for the prosecution, 70 for the defense. The prosecution rested its case on the pig woman's story, the fingerprint, and the circumstantial evidence of motive and opportunity. The defense rested its case on the destruction of Gibson's credibility, the compromised physical evidence, and the composed testimony of the defendants themselves. The jury retired to deliberate on the 3rd of December, 1926, 4 years and 2 months after the bodies had been found beneath the crabapple tree. They took 3 votes. The first was 10-2 for acquittal, the second was 11-1, the third was unanimous. After 5 hours and 8 minutes, the jury returned its verdict. Frances Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Stevens were found not guilty of the murder of Alina Reinhardt Mills. The charges against Henry Carpenter were subsequently dropped. He was never tried. Frances Hall emerged from the courthouse and told reporters that she had expected nothing less. She returned to 23 Nickel Avenue, to her dark-paneled rooms and her quiet life, and she never spoke publicly about the case again. She sued the New York Daily Mirror for $3 million in damages. The case was settled out of court for an unspecified sum that was widely reported to be enormous. No one else was ever charged with the murders of Edward Hall and Alina Mills. No murder weapon was ever found. No confession was ever made. Frances Hall died at her home on the 19th of December, 1942, after a long illness. Willie Stevens died 11 days later on the 30th of December. Henry Stevens had already been dead for 3 years. He died of a heart attack on the 3rd of December, 1939, the 13th anniversary of the acquittal. The case was never closed. It remains, more than a century later, one of the most notorious unsolved murders in American history. And the question that hung over the courtroom in Somerville, the question that the jury could not answer with certainty, and that no one has answered since, is the same one that hung over the Phillips farm on that Saturday morning in September of 1922. Who stood beneath the crabapple tree on the night of the 14th of September and cut the tongue from Eleanor Mills's throat? That is the story of what happened in New Brunswick. The affair, the murders, the destroyed crime scene, the failed investigation, the 4 years of silence, and the trial that ended in acquittal. But knowing what happened does not answer the deeper questions. Why were the bodies arranged side by side, as though posed for a photograph that no one was meant to see? Why was Eleanor Mills's tongue removed, not just her life taken, but the specific organ of her voice carved from her body? Why were the love letters torn up and scattered around the corpses, rather than destroyed or taken away? Why was Edward Hall's calling card propped against his shoe, identifying him to anyone who found the scene? And why did the killer or killers spend time arranging the bodies with such care, when every additional minute at the scene increased the risk of being caught? In part 2, we are going to go through the psychology behind this case. Not to solve it, the evidence for that is gone, but to understand what the crime scene itself reveals about the kind of mind that created it. What the posing of the bodies tells us about the motive behind the killing. What the removal of the tongue suggests about the killer's relationship to Eleanor's voice. What the scattered letters reveal about whether this was a private act of rage or a public statement meant to be read. And why this case, after more than 100 years, still holds the mind in a grip it cannot quite explain. The first thing that any modern criminal investigator would notice about the Hall Mills crime scene is that it was not left behind. It was built. Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills were not found in the positions in which they died. They were found in positions that someone had chosen for them after death. His arm was placed beneath her shoulder. Her hand was resting on his knee. His hat was covering his face, concealing the bullet wound. Her scarf was wound around her throat, hiding the gash. Their feet pointed toward the crabapple tree. Their clothing had been smoothed and adjusted, his suit unwrinkled, her dress tugged below her knees. His glasses had been repositioned on his face, his eyes had been closed. And between them, torn into pieces and scattered in the grass, were the love letters that told the world exactly what these two people had been to one another. This is not what a crime scene looks like when someone kills in a panic and flees. This is not what a crime scene looks like when rage overwhelms a person and they strike without thinking. This is a crime scene that required time, thought, and a specific intention about how the bodies would be found and what they would communicate when they were. In forensic behavioral analysis, there is a critical distinction between two types of deliberate alteration at a crime scene. The first is called staging. Staging occurs when a killer rearranges the scene to mislead investigators, to make a murder look like a suicide, for example, or to make a premeditated killing appear to be a burglary gone wrong. Staging is functional. It serves the killer's practical interest in avoiding detection. The second is called posing. Posing occurs when a killer arranges the victim's body to fulfill a psychological need, to send a message, to express something, to complete a fantasy. Posing is not functional in any investigative sense. It does not help the killer avoid being caught. In fact, it increases the risk, because it requires the killer to spend additional time at the scene doing something that serves no purpose other than satisfying an internal compulsion. The Hall Mills crime scene was not staged. Nothing about the arrangement of the bodies was designed to mislead anyone about what had happened. The calling card identified the male victim immediately. The love letters made the nature of the relationship unmistakable. The positioning of the bodies, side by side, in a lover's embrace, made it clear that whoever did this wanted the world to know exactly what it was looking at. This was posing, and the message it sent was not subtle. The bodies were arranged to look like lovers, the arm beneath the shoulder, the hand on the knee, the heads inclined toward one another. It was a tableau, a frozen image of the relationship that had brought these two people to this place on this night. But it was not a celebration of that relationship. It was a mockery of it. The love letters were not placed gently beside the bodies. They were torn up, ripped into pieces, and scattered like confetti. The calling card was not tucked into Hall's pocket. It was propped against his shoe, facing outward as if to say, "Here is his name. Here is who he is, let everyone see." The scarf around Alina's throat was not a gesture of tenderness. It was concealment, but selective concealment. The killer hid the wound, but left the letters. The killer covered the violence, but displayed the sin. The scene was constructed so that the first thing anyone would see was the affair, the embrace, the letters, the names, and only afterward would they discover what had been done to the bodies. In criminal psychology, when a killer poses the victims of a crime that is motivated by jealousy, betrayal, or moral outrage, the posing almost always serves as a form of public shaming. The bodies are arranged to expose the thing that the killer found intolerable, the transgression, the secret, the humiliation that drove them to kill. The Hall Mills posing is a textbook example of this pattern. The killer did not try to hide the affair. The killer put it on display. The torn letters, the calling card, the lover's pose, all of it was designed to ensure that when the bodies were found, the first and most powerful impression would be one of scandal. This is not the behavior of a stranger. This is not the behavior of a robber who killed during a theft gone wrong, then inexplicably spent 20 minutes arranging bodies and scattering love letters. This is the behavior of someone who was personally wounded by the relationship between these two people, someone for whom the affair was not merely known but felt deeply and intolerably. The posing says, look at what they were doing, look at what they were, let the whole world see it. It is an act of exposure, an act of punishment, an act of someone who believed that these two people deserved not just death, but humiliation, that their secret should be ripped open and displayed for everyone to judge. And this tells us something important about the motive behind the killing. Whatever else was happening under Russie's Lane that night, whatever rage or grief or calculation drove the killer to pull the trigger, the aftermath was not chaotic. It was deliberate, it was composed. It was the work of someone who had a very clear idea of what this scene should look like when it was finished. The killer was not merely ending the affair. The killer was making a statement about it. And that statement was meant to be read by everyone who found it. Alina Mills was shot 3 times in the head. Any one of those wounds would have been sufficient to kill her. The .32 caliber bullets entered her skull under the right eye, over the right temple, and over the right ear. She was dead or dying beyond any possibility of recovery before anything else was done to her. And then someone cut her throat from ear to ear. The wound was so deep that it severed her windpipe, her esophagus, her jugular vein, and the muscles of her neck. Her backbone was visible through the opening. This was not a careful incision. It was an act of tremendous force, delivered to a woman who was already beyond feeling it. And then, as the second autopsy 4 years later would reveal, someone reached into the wound and removed her tongue. They cut out her larynx. They took from her body the physical organs of speech and song, and they carried those organs away. They were never recovered. In forensic psychology, there is a term for mutilation that occurs after death, and that targets a specific body part with symbolic significance. It is called expressive mutilation, violence directed not at the body as a whole, but at a particular feature of the victim that held meaning for the killer. Expressive mutilation is distinguished from instrumental violence, the violence required to actually cause death. The bullets that killed Alina Mills were instrumental. They accomplished the objective of ending her life. Everything that came after, the throat, the tongue, served no instrumental purpose at all. Alina was already dead. The additional violence could not make her more dead. It could not silence her because she had already been silenced by the bullets. So the question becomes, what was the mutilation for? The answer lies in what the tongue and the larynx represented, not in a general sense, but in the specific context of this particular victim and this particular crime. Alina Mills was a singer. Her voice was the thing that had first drawn Edward Hall to her. When she sang hymns in the church, her soprano rose above the others and drifted into the rafters, and the rector heard something in it that he experienced as divine. He wrote sermons while listening to her sing. He fell in love with her voice before he fell in love with anything else. And the voice was also the instrument of the affair itself. The love letters make clear that Alina and Edward talked constantly, not just about their feelings, but about theology, about books, about their shared conviction that God had blessed their union. Alina's words, spoken and written, were the thread that held the relationship together. Her voice was what made her dangerous. Whoever killed Alina Mills knew this. They knew that her voice was the weapon she had used, the thing that had seduced the rector, the thing that had drawn him away from his wife, the thing that had spoken the words of love that filled all those letters scattered in the grass. And so they destroyed it, not figuratively, not symbolically in some abstract sense, but literally. They opened her throat, reached inside, and cut out the physical organs that had produced the sounds that had caused all of this. In cases where killers remove specific body parts after death, forensic psychologists look at the relationship between the body part and the perceived transgression. When hands are removed, it often relates to something the victim did: theft, infidelity conducted through touch. When eyes are destroyed, it often relates to something the victim saw, or to the killer's sense of being watched or judged. When the tongue or throat is targeted, it almost always relates to speech, to something the victim said or sang or could say in the future. The removal of Alina's tongue was not a random act of mutilation committed in a frenzy. It was targeted. It was specific. It required the killer to make a deliberate decision about what to do after the murder was already complete, to select this particular form of desecration from among all the possible things that could be done to a body, and to carry it out with enough precision to remove the organs intact and take them away. This level of specificity tells us several things about the killer's psychological state. First, it tells us that the rage behind this murder was not diffuse, it was focused. The killer was not angry at Alina Mills in a general sense, angry at her existence, angry at the world, angry in a way that might express itself through indiscriminate destruction. The killer was angry at something specific about Alina Mills, and that something was her voice. Second, it tells us that the killing itself was not enough to satisfy whatever need was driving the killer. Shooting Alina 3 times in the head ended her life, but it did not complete the psychological act that the killer needed to perform. The act was not complete until the voice had been physically destroyed, until the thing that had caused the damage had been removed from the world. Third, it tells us that the killer experienced Alina's voice as a source of personal injury. This was not an abstract grievance. This was someone who had been hurt, directly and specifically, by the words that came from Alina Mills's mouth, or by what those words had accomplished. In the study of homicides driven by sexual jealousy or betrayal, researchers have identified a pattern they sometimes call the destruction of the rival's instrument. It refers to the tendency of killers who are motivated by romantic jealousy to focus their post-mortem violence on the specific attribute of the victim that they perceive as having stolen their partner. A woman who loses her husband to a younger, more beautiful rival may focus her rage on the rival's face. A man who loses his wife to a more eloquent, more charming competitor may focus his rage on the competitor's mouth or tongue. The destruction is not practical. It does not undo the betrayal. It does not bring the partner back, but it satisfies something deep in the killer's psychology, a need to annihilate the specific quality that made the rival dangerous. To reduce the threat to nothing, to take away the one thing that the victim had and that the killer did not. If Frances Hall was responsible for what happened on De Russey's Lane, or if someone acting on her behalf was responsible, then the removal of Alina's tongue takes on a specific and devastating meaning. Frances Hall could not sing, she was not beautiful, she was not young. She was not the kind of woman whose voice drifted into rafters and made men feel the presence of God. She was, by every account, a practical, austere, and physically unremarkable woman whose hold on her husband was financial and social rather than romantic or spiritual. Alina Mills had something that Frances Hall could never possess, the ability to enchant Edward Hall through the sound of her voice. And on the night of the 14th of September, someone cut that ability out of Alina's body and carried it away. The tongue was never found. Whoever took it kept it, or destroyed it somewhere else in private, away from the scene. Either way, the act of removal was the final statement in a crime scene that was full of statements. The bullet said, "You will die for this." The posing said, "Everyone will know what you were." The letters said, "Your secret is over." And the tongue said, "You will never speak again. You will never sing again. The thing that made him love you is gone." It is, in the entire case, the detail that most clearly reveals the emotional core of the killing. Not greed, not pragmatism, not the cold calculation of someone eliminating a threat to their inheritance or their social position. Rage, specific, targeted, deeply personal rage, directed at the one thing Alina Mills had that her killer could not take away by any other means. There were dozens of love letters scattered around the bodies beneath the crabapple tree. They had been torn into pieces, ripped apart by hand, and strewn in the grass between the two corpses like a display. The letters were written by Eleanor Mills to Edward Hall. They were passionate, spiritual, and explicit in their longing. They documented an affair that had lasted years. They named both parties. They left no room for ambiguity about what these two people had been to one another. And whoever killed them did not destroy those letters. They did not burn them, pocket them, or carry them away. They tore them up and left them in plain sight, arranged around the bodies for anyone to find. This is one of the most psychologically significant details in the entire case, and it is significant precisely because of what the killer chose not to do. Destroying evidence is what a killer does when the priority is self-preservation. A murderer who is thinking clearly about avoiding detection would take the letters. They are incriminating not to the dead, who are beyond prosecution, but potentially to the killer, because they establish motive. Love letters found at the scene of a double murder immediately point investigators toward the wronged spouse. Leaving them behind is, from a strategic standpoint, an act of recklessness bordering on confession. But the killer did not simply leave the letters behind. The killer displayed them. Tore them up and scattered them around the bodies like a frame around a painting, ensuring that they would be the first thing anyone noticed, ensuring that the story they told would be read before the bodies were even moved. This tells us that concealment was not the killer's priority, exposure was. The torn letters served the same function as the posing of the bodies, the calling card propped against Hall's shoe, and the lovers' embrace in which the corpses were arranged. They were part of a single, unified message, a message that said, look at what these people were doing, look at the words she wrote to him, look at what they believed about themselves, let the whole world read it. In criminal psychology, there is a concept called the punitive crime scene. It describes a murder in which the killer's primary psychological need is not simply to end the victim's life, but to punish them, to ensure that the victim's transgression is exposed, judged, and condemned in the public eye. In a punitive crime scene, the killer acts as both executioner and prosecutor. The death is the sentence. The crime scene is the trial, and the evidence left behind deliberately, ostentatiously, is the case for the prosecution, laid out for the world to weigh. The Hall Mills crime scene is one of the clearest examples of a punitive crime scene in American criminal history. Every element of it was designed not to conceal but to reveal, not to obscure the motive but to declare it, not to protect the killer but to condemn the dead. This carries a specific psychological implication. A killer who prioritizes exposure over concealment is a killer who believes that the public will agree with them. They believe that when the world sees what these victims were doing, the world will understand why they had to die. The torn letters were not just evidence of an affair. They were the killer's argument. The killer was saying, read these words. See what this woman wrote to a married man. See what this minister was doing behind his wife's back. See the sin. And then ask yourself whether they deserved what they got. This is the psychology of moral certainty. The killer did not experience what they were doing as murder in the ordinary sense, an act that must be hidden because it is wrong. They experienced it as justice, an act that should be displayed because it is right, a correction of a moral order that had been violated, carried out by someone who believed they had the authority, perhaps even the obligation, to set things straight. The calling card reinforces this interpretation. It was propped against Hall's shoe with the printed side facing outward, his name, his title, his church. It was not left accidentally. It was placed there with the same deliberation as everything else at the scene. The card said, this is a man of God, this is a minister, a rector, a shepherd of his flock, and look at what he was doing. The card forced anyone who found the body to reckon with the contradiction between what Hall was supposed to be and what he actually was. It turned his title into an indictment. It used his own identity against him. This is consistent with what psychologists call the moralizing offender, a killer whose violence is driven not by personal gain, not by sexual compulsion, not by psychopathy, but by a rigid and punitive moral framework that the killer believes the victim has violated. Moralizing offenders frequently leave explanatory evidence at the scene. They want the crime to be understood on their terms. They want the victim's transgression to be visible because in their minds the transgression is what justifies the killing. Without the transgression, the killing would be murder. With it, the killing becomes punishment, deserved, appropriate, and righteous. The love letters were the killer's proof. They were the exhibit in a trial that was never going to happen in a courtroom, a trial held on a dirt lane beneath a crabapple tree, in which the dead were convicted and sentenced in a single act. But there is something else worth noting about the decision to leave the letters behind rather than destroy them. It was a decision that inflicted maximum damage on the reputations of both victims, but it also inflicted enormous damage on Frances Hall. If Frances was the killer, or if she directed the killing, then the scattering of the letters was an act that publicly confirmed her husband's infidelity in the most humiliating way possible. It told the entire world, every newspaper reader, every neighbor, every congregant at St. John's, that her husband had been writing words of burning love to another woman for years. A woman who cared primarily about appearances, and Frances Hall cared deeply about appearances, would not ordinarily choose to broadcast her own humiliation. She would destroy the letters. She would eliminate the evidence of the affair that shamed her. Unless the need to punish was stronger than the need to protect her pride. Unless the rage had reached a point where exposing Eleanor Mills, branding her as an adulteress in front of the entire country, mattered more than Frances's own dignity. Unless the act of tearing those letters apart and scattering them in the dirt was itself a form of satisfaction, a way of saying that these words, these declarations of love that had stolen her husband, were worth nothing, less than nothing. Garbage to be ripped up and thrown on the ground beside the bodies of the people who had written them. This reading is speculative, it cannot be proven, but it is consistent with everything else the crime scene communicates. A killer who was willing to sacrifice concealment, self-protection, and even personal dignity in order to ensure that the world saw these two people for what they were. The letters were not destroyed because they were too important to destroy. They were the killer's evidence, they were the killer's justification, and in the killer's mind, they were the reason that everything else on that crime scene was not murder, but justice. There is a contradiction at the heart of the Hall Mills crime scene that has troubled investigators and researchers for over a century. On one hand, the scene displays extraordinary control. The bodies were moved and arranged with care. The clothing was adjusted. The hat was placed over Hall's face. The glasses were repositioned. The calling card was propped precisely against his shoe. The letters were torn and scattered in a deliberate pattern. The scarf was wound around Eleanor's throat to conceal the wound. This is the work of someone who is thinking clearly, someone who is not in a panic. Someone who has a specific vision of how this scene should look and is taking the time, minutes, perhaps many minutes, to execute that vision in the dark, beside two people they have just killed. On the other hand, the mutilation of Eleanor Mills was an act of extreme and focused violence that far exceeded anything required to cause death. Her throat was cut with such force that it nearly severed her head from her body. Her tongue and larynx were carved out. These are not the actions of a composed and deliberate mind. These are the actions of someone in the grip of an emotion so overwhelming that it demands physical expression beyond the killing itself. The posing is calm, the mutilation is frenzied. Both happened at the same scene, to the same victim on the same night, and the question this raises is one of the most important in the entire case. How do these two psychological states coexist in the same event? In forensic behavioral analysis, when a crime scene displays both highly organized elements and highly disorganized elements, investigators consider several possibilities. The first is that more than one person was involved. If the Hall Mills murders were committed by a group, as the prosecution alleged, pointing to Frances Hall and her brothers, then the contradiction resolves itself naturally. One person may have been responsible for the shooting, another for the mutilation, and another for the posing. Different hands, different psychological states, different roles within a single event. In this reading, the mutilation of Eleanor's throat might have been carried out by someone consumed with rage, someone whose fury at Eleanor was so personal and so intense that bullets were not enough. And the posing might have been carried out afterward by someone calmer, someone more methodical, someone thinking about the message the scene would send when it was discovered. Frances Hall in this scenario might have been the planner, the person who orchestrated the confrontation, who decided what would happen and how the aftermath would be arranged. And one of her brothers, Willie perhaps, whose neighbors at the firehouse believed he was capable of explosive rage when provoked, might have been the one who could not stop at the killing. The the one who needed to destroy Alina's throat and tear out her tongue. This interpretation is consistent with the prosecution's theory and with the testimony of Jane Gibson, who described multiple figures at the scene. It is also consistent with the physical evidence. The expert marksmanship required to place 3 shots so closely together in Alina's skull suggested someone with Henry Stevens' training, while the raw violence of the throat wound suggested a different kind of actor entirely. The second possibility is that a single person committed all of it, the shooting, the mutilation, and the posing, and that what we are seeing in the crime scene is not 2 different people, but 2 different psychological states operating within the same individual at different moments. This is not as unusual as it might sound. In cases of murder driven by intense personal betrayal, what forensic psychologists call crimes of passion, though that phrase obscures more than it reveals, it is common for the killer to cycle between states of overwhelming rage and states of eerie calm. The rage comes first. It drives the killing itself. It drives the overkill, the additional violence that continues after the victim is already dead. It drives the mutilation, the destruction, the need to keep hurting the body long past the point where it can feel anything. And then the rage subsides, not gradually but suddenly, like a wave that has crested and broken, and in its place comes something else, a clarity, coldness, a sudden awareness of what has been done and what needs to happen next. It is in this second state, the calm after the storm, that the posing might have occurred. The killer, having exhausted their rage on Alina's body, may have stepped back, looked at the scene, and begun to compose it. To arrange the bodies, to scatter the letters, to place the card, to pull down the hem of Alina's dress and wind the scarf around her throat. This would explain the apparent contradiction. The mutilation and the posing did not need to come from different minds. They may have come from the same mind at different moments, the moment of maximum emotional intensity, and the moment immediately after, when the intensity drained away and was replaced by something calculated and deliberate. There is a third possibility, and it is perhaps the most psychologically complex. It is possible that the posing was not a separate act from the rage, but an extension of it. That arranging the bodies was not something the killer did after the anger passed, but something they did while the anger was still burning, a different expression of the same fury. In this reading, the posing is not calm at all. It only appears calm because it is orderly, but order and calm are not the same thing. A person can arrange objects with tremendous precision while in a state of white-hot rage, because the arrangement itself is the expression of the rage. Every adjustment of the body, every letter torn and scattered, every detail placed just so, all of it is the anger speaking, not through violence this time, but through composition, through the creation of a scene that says exactly what the killer needs the world to hear. The fury did not end when the mutilation ended. It simply changed form. It went from destruction to construction, from tearing Alina apart to building the tableau that would expose her to the world. If this reading is correct, then the entire crime scene, from the first bullet to the last letter scattered in the grass, was a single continuous act of rage. Not a frenzy followed by calm calculation, but rage expressing itself in 2 different modes: physical violence and symbolic arrangement, destruction and display. The hand that rages and the mind that plans, operating simultaneously, driven by the same engine. This would make the Hall Mills crime scene not a contradiction, but a unity. A single emotional act carried out across multiple forms of expression, by someone whose fury was large enough and articulate enough to encompass both the cutting of a throat and the careful placement of a calling card against a dead man's shoe. Whatever the truth, one killer or several, one emotional state or 2, the crime scene tells us that the person or people responsible for these murders were driven by something far deeper than practical self-interest. A killer motivated by money, by inheritance, by the elimination of a rival, such a killer would shoot and leave. Such a killer would not spend 20 minutes in the dark arranging bodies and scattering love letters. Such a killer would not remove a tongue. What happened on De Russey's Lane required passion. It required a personal investment in the suffering and humiliation of the victims that goes far beyond anything that mere practicality could produce. This was not a murder committed to solve a problem. This was a murder committed to express something so large, so consuming, and so inarticulate that it could only be said through the arrangement of dead bodies on a country lane in the middle of the night. There is a moment in every criminal investigation where the machinery of justice encounters the machinery of wealth, and one of them gives way. In the Hall Mills case, that moment did not arrive dramatically. It arrived quietly in the first hours after the bodies were found, and it never stopped operating from that point forward. Frances Hall's first act upon learning of her husband's death was not to demand answers from the police. It was to call her family attorney. Her second act was to hire Timothy Pfeiffer, not as a private investigator working alongside the police, but as a private investigator working on her behalf, answerable only to her, whose role was to manage the flow of information about the case. Within days, the Stevens Carpenter family had assembled a legal wall around itself that the underfunded county prosecutors could not penetrate. Every family member who was contacted by police was advised by counsel before speaking. Every request for information was filtered through attorneys. Every public statement was crafted, measured, and strategically timed. This is not evidence of guilt. Innocent people hire lawyers. Wealthy people protect their reputations. There is nothing criminal about refusing to speak to the police without counsel present. But in the context of a murder investigation, one in which the primary suspects are members of the victim's own family, the effect of this legal insulation was devastating. It did not merely protect the suspects from wrongful accusation. It protected them from investigation itself. The police in 1922 were not equipped to overcome this kind of resistance. They had limited resources, limited legal authority, and limited experience dealing with suspects whose personal wealth exceeded the entire annual budget of the county prosecutor's office. They could not compel cooperation. They could not match the legal talent arrayed against them. They could not even preserve their own evidence without interference, as the subsequent disappearance of key documents, the return of Willie's revolver, and the mysterious departure of Trooper Dickman would all demonstrate. In criminal psychology, there is a well-documented phenomenon in which the social status of a suspect distorts the perception of investigators, prosecutors, and juries. It is sometimes called the halo effect of respectability, the unconscious assumption that people of wealth, education, and social standing are less likely to commit violent crimes than people of lower status. This assumption has no basis in fact. Wealthy people murder for the same reasons as anyone else: jealousy, rage, betrayal, greed, humiliation. But the assumption persists because it is reinforced by every other aspect of how the justice system operates. Wealthy suspects can afford better lawyers. They present better in court. They have character witnesses who are themselves prominent and respected. They speak with the vocabulary and bearing of people who are accustomed to being believed. Frances Hall understood this instinctively. Her behavior throughout the investigation and the trial was a masterclass in the performance of respectability under pressure. She never raised her voice, she never broke composure, she never said anything that could be quoted against her. She sat in the courtroom in black, the picture of dignified widowhood, and allowed her attorneys to do the work of dismantling the prosecution's case. The jury saw what she wanted them to see: a woman of breeding, of restraint, of social consequence. Not the kind of woman who would cut another woman's throat on a dirt lane in the dark. Not the kind of woman who would tear up love letters and scatter them around a corpse. The violence of the crime scene and the composure of the defendant seemed to belong to two different worlds, and the jury could not reconcile them. This is the halo effect in action. The jury was not consciously biased in favor of the defendants, or at least, they would not have described themselves that way. But the unconscious calculation was always operating beneath the surface. People like this do not do things like that. It is a cognitive shortcut that has protected wealthy defendants in courtrooms for centuries. The 1922 grand jury's decision not to indict can be understood in the same terms. 67 witnesses were called, evidence was presented. And at the end of it, the grand jury simply could not bring itself to charge one of the most prominent families in New Brunswick with a double murder. It was not that the evidence was insufficient. It was that the evidence pointed in a direction that the social order of the city could not comfortably accept. Indicting Frances Hall meant indicting the Stevens name, the Carpenter name, the network of wealth and influence that had shaped New Brunswick for over a century. It meant accepting that the woman who had taught Sunday school, who had hosted charity events, who had donated to every civic cause in the city, was capable of orchestrating the slaughter of two people on a country lane. The grand jury could not do it, and 4 years later, when a different jury was finally asked to weigh the evidence, they could not do it either. This does not mean that Frances Hall was guilty. It is entirely possible that she and her brothers were innocent, that the crime was committed by someone else entirely, and that the investigation's focus on the Stevens family was a product of circumstantial suspicion and tabloid pressure rather than genuine evidence. But it does mean that we will never know, because the wealth of the Stevens Carpenter family did not merely provide a defense at trial. It shaped the investigation from the first day forward, determining which questions were asked, which witnesses were pressured, which evidence was preserved, and which was allowed to quietly disappear. The Somerset County prosecutor in 1922, Azariah Beekman, systematically mislaid vital evidence. His brother attempted to sell grand jury testimony to a tabloid. A state trooper investigating the case was paid $2,500 to leave the state. These are not the marks of an investigation that was merely incompetent. They are the marks of an investigation that was actively interfered with by money, by influence, by the quiet pressure that powerful families can exert on small-town officials without ever making an explicit threat. Whether that interference was directed by Frances Hall herself, or whether it was simply the natural consequence of investigating a family that no one in the county wanted to cross, is a question that cannot be answered with certainty. But the effect is the same. The investigation was crippled before it began, the evidence was compromised, the witnesses were intimidated, and by the time the case reached a courtroom 4 years later, the prosecution was fighting with weapons that had been blunted almost beyond use. Wealth did not exonerate Frances Hall. The jury did that. But wealth ensured that the jury never saw the full case, because the full case had been eroded, piece by piece, over 4 years, by the quiet and relentless application of money and social power. In the end, the acquittal may have been the correct verdict given the evidence that remained. But the evidence that remained was not the evidence that existed on the morning of the 16th of September, 1922. That evidence had been destroyed, not by time, not by accident, but by the same force that had always protected the Stevens family from consequences. The Armour held, and whatever truth lay behind it was sealed away forever. More than 100 years have passed since the morning of the 16th of September, 1922. Frances Hall is dead, Willie Stevens is dead, Henry Stevens is dead. Henry Carpenter is dead, Jane Gibson is dead, James Mills is dead, Charlotte Mills is dead. Every witness, every suspect, every investigator, every juror, all of them are gone. The crabapple tree was stripped bare within weeks of the discovery and has long since vanished. The Phillips farm was developed decades ago. De Russey's Lane was paved over and renamed Franklin Boulevard. The Church of St. John the Evangelist still stands on its corner in New Brunswick, but the congregation that once filled its pews, the congregation that whispered about the rector and the choir singer, has been replaced many times over. Nothing physical remains of this case, no evidence, no crime scene, no witnesses to interview, no suspect to charge, and yet the case will not go away. Books continue to be written about it. In 1964, the attorney William Kunstler published The Minister and the Choir Singer. In 1999, Gerald Tomlinson published Fatal Tryst. In 2019, Richard Sears Walling published Edward and Eleanor and the Wages of Sin. In 2022, Joe Pompeo published Blood and Ink. Each author approaches the case from a different angle. Each arrives at a different conclusion, or no conclusion at all. And each finds, despite the passage of decades, that there is still an audience hungry to hear the story told again. The case has been adapted into novels, plays, graphic novels, and podcasts. In 2019, the Church of St. John the Evangelist itself, the very church where Hall preached and Eleanor sang, sponsored a theatrical reenactment of the events. They revived the production in 2022, 100 years after the murders, to an audience that filled the house for nearly a month. The question is why, not why the murders happened. We have spent the better part of this discussion examining that question, but why the case persists, why it continues to exert a hold on the public imagination that far outlasts the lives of everyone involved. The answer begins with something that psychologists have understood for nearly a century. In the 1920s, the same decade in which the Hall Mills trial captivated the nation, a psychologist named Bluma Zygarnik conducted a series of experiments on memory and attention. She discovered that people remember uncompleted tasks far more vividly and persistently than completed ones. When a task is finished, the brain files it away. The mental tension dissolves, but when a task is interrupted, when the ending never arrives, the brain keeps it active. It remains in an open loop, periodically resurfacing, demanding resolution. This became known as the Zeigarnik effect, and it is one of the most reliable principles in cognitive psychology. It explains why an unfinished conversation stays in your mind for days, while a completed one fades within hours. It explains why cliffhangers work. It explains why unsolved puzzles nag at the mind long after solved ones have been forgotten. The Hall Mills case is an open loop that has never been closed. 8 people sat in a courtroom in 1926, and 12 jurors told the world that they could not say with certainty who had killed Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. From that moment forward, the case entered a permanent state of irresolution, not because the evidence was insufficient to form theories, but because no theory could ever be confirmed. Most people who study this case believe they know who did it. The circumstantial evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction, toward Frances Hall, toward her brothers, toward the family whose honor had been violated, and whose resources were sufficient to arrange both a murder and its cover-up. Gerald Tomlinson, who spent years researching the case, concluded that the Stevens siblings were guilty. Most modern commentators agree. But believing is not the same as knowing, and knowing is not the same as proving. The acquittal stands, the case is officially unsolved, and the brain cannot accept that. It keeps returning to the details. The fingerprint on the calling card, was it genuine or was it planted? The pig woman's testimony, was any of it true? Frances Hall's remark to James Mills on Friday morning, how did she know they were dead? Willie's cryptic statement to the maid, what terrible thing had happened that night? Each detail is a thread that leads somewhere but never arrives. Each theory resolves some contradictions while introducing others. And the mind, unable to reach a conclusion that accounts for everything, keeps circling back, keeps pulling at the threads, keeps looking for the one detail that will finally close the loop. It never finds it, and it never will, because the evidence that might have provided certainty was destroyed in the first hours after the bodies were found, trampled by souvenir hunters, mishandled by police, eroded by money and time, and the deliberate interference of people who had the means to make inconvenient facts disappear. The case is unsolvable not because the truth is unknowable in principle, but because the physical record that could confirm it has been permanently erased. We are left with probability rather than proof, and probability, however strong, cannot close an open loop. There is a second reason the case persists, and it has to do with the specific nature of what the crime scene communicated. The Hall Mills murder scene was designed to tell a story. It was arranged, posed, composed, constructed by someone who wanted the world to read it as a narrative. The lover's embrace, the torn letters, the calling card, the concealed wound, every element was placed with intention, and the intention was legibility. The killer wanted this scene to be understood. And it was understood immediately, viscerally, by everyone who saw it or read about it. The story was clear. A minister and his lover, a forbidden affair, a punishment. The scene communicated with the efficiency of a tabloid headline, and the tabloids responded accordingly. But here is the paradox. The crime scene told a story, but it did not name its author. The killer created a narrative that was perfectly legible in every respect except one. It said what the victims had done. It said why they deserved what they got. It said everything except who had done it to them. This is the specific frustration of the Hall Mills case. It is not a mystery in which the facts are opaque and the motive is unclear. It is a mystery in which the motive is screaming from every detail of the crime scene, and the identity of the killer is hidden behind a wall of legal privilege and destroyed evidence. We know why this happened. We know what the killer was feeling. We know what they were trying to say. The crime scene is one of the most articulate and psychologically transparent in the history of American murder, and we cannot prove who made it. That combination, a crime scene that speaks volumes and an investigation that produced nothing, is uniquely maddening to the human mind. It is a story that is 99% complete. The characters are drawn, the motive is established, the narrative arc is clear. Only the final page is missing, the page that names the person who stood beneath the crabapple tree with a gun and a knife and a handful of torn-up love letters. That missing page is what keeps people coming back. Not because they expect to find it. A century of searching has confirmed that it is gone, but because the brain cannot stop looking. The loop is too close to being closed. The story is too nearly complete. The mind keeps reaching for the ending, and the ending keeps receding. The crabapple tree is gone. The lane has been paved. The church still stands, but the voices that once filled it have been silent for generations. Eleanor Mills's soprano has not drifted into those rafters for more than 100 years. But the question remains. It has outlived every person it was ever asked about, and it will outlive everyone reading this now. Who stood beneath that tree, who tore up those letters, who cut out Eleanor's tongue? The answer is somewhere in the dark of a September night in 1922, sealed behind a wall of wealth and silence, and the passage of more time than any evidence can survive. And that is exactly why it never goes away. If you've made it this far, I'm curious. Do you think Frances Hall and her brothers drove to de Russey's Lane that night and did what the pig woman said they did? Do you think it was Willie whose rage turned a confrontation into a slaughter? Do you think James Mills knew more than he ever admitted? Or do you think the truth died with someone whose name was never spoken in a courtroom? Someone who walked away from that crabapple tree and was never suspected at all? Leave a comment and let me know, but for now, have a good rest.